Good evening and welcome to Monday Night Playhouse. I'm Damiano Pietropaolo and I am here at the Royal George Theatre in Niagara-on-the-Lake, home of the Shaw Festival. I'm here with Artistic Director Jackie Maxwell for the fourth of this season's Bell Canada Reading Series. Hello, Jackie.
Hi, Damiano.
I gather we're waiting for the appearance of a very special guest.
Well, we are indeed. And he's somewhat late, I fear.
You have a full house waiting for him. I hope he's not far away.
Well, Gilbert Keith Chesterton was never known for his predictability.
Ah, yes. GKC, friend and foe of Mr. Bernard Shaw himself.
Very much. Mr. Chesterton was an icon all to himself. A giant, really, in modern literature.
Mm-hmm.
He was an essayist, critic, poet, novelist, social commentator, extremely controversial, like his pal, Bernard Shaw, and very, very funny.
And will he be reading from his own works?
Oh, yes, ably assisted by one of our veteran actors, Mr. Neil Barclay, and it was all put together by Mr. Tony Van Bridge.
One of the Shaw Festival's most revered and senior actors.
Yes, with his own history and contribution to Canadian theatre that is a story in itself.
And maybe destined for radio, too.
Oh, that would be nice.
He really is quite late.
I'm wondering if... wait, I think...
I must apologize for being late. But since I had to give up my seat on the bus to two ladies, I decided to walk. Now, I am firmly of the opinion that I was born on the 29th of May, 1874, on Camden Hill, Kensington, and baptized in the little church of St. George, opposite the large waterworks tower that dominates that ridge. I indignantly deny that the church was chosen because it needed the whole water power of West London to turn me into a Christian. The very first thing I can ever remember seeing with my own eyes was a young man walking across a bridge. He had a curly moustache and an attitude of confidence verging on swagger. He carried in his hand a disproportionately large key of a shining yellow metal, and wore a large golden or gilded crown. The bridge he was crossing on sprang on the one side from the edge of a highly perilous mountain chasm, and at the other end it joined the upper part of the tower of an almost excessively castellated castle. In the castle tower there was one window, out of which a young lady was looking. I cannot remember in the least what she looked like, but I will do battle with anyone who denies her superlative good looks. To those who may object that such a scene is rare in the home life of house agents living immediately to the north of Kensington High Street, I shall be compelled to admit not that the scene was unreal, but that I saw it through a window much more wonderful than the window in the tower. I saw it through the proscenium arch of a toy theatre constructed by my father, and that the young man in the crown was about 6 inches high, and proved on investigation to be made of cardboard. I have no shadow of recollection of what the young man was doing on the bridge, or of what he proposed to do with the key, though a later and wearier knowledge of literature and legend hints to me that he was not improbably going to release the lady from captivity. All the rest is gone. Scenes, subject, story, characters. But that one scene glows in my memory like a glimpse of some incredible paradise. And for all I know, I shall still remember it when all other memory is gone out of my mind. Early impressions count considerably in life. All my life I have loved edges and the boundary lines that bring one thing sharply against another, prosceniums and frames, limits. And I will maintain that the largest wilderness looks larger seen through a window. I've said that the toy theatre was made by my father. It is therefore to him that I owe so much for this first picture of life. My father was the head of a hereditary business of house agents and surveyors, which had already been established for some 3 generations in Kensington. My people belonged to that rather old-fashioned English middle class. And one peculiarity of this middle class was that it really was a class, and it really was in the middle. Both for good and evil. and certainly often to excess, it was separated both from the class above it and the class below. It knew far too little of the working classes, to the grave peril of a later generation. It knew far too little even of its own servants. There was a sort of silence and embarrassment between them. A lady of my family went to live in a friend's house during the friend's absence, to be waited on by a sort of superior servant. Now, the lady had got it fixed in her head that the servant cooked her own meals separately, whereas the servant was equally fixed on the policy of eating what was left over from the lady's meals. Now, the servant sent up for breakfast, say, 5 rashers of bacon, which was more than the lady wanted. But the lady had another fixed freak of conscience, common in the ladies of the period. She thought that nothing should be wasted, and could not see that even a thing consumed is wasted if not wanted. She ate the 5 rashers. The servant consequently sent up 7 rashers. The lady paled a little, but followed the path of duty and ate them all. The servant, beginning to feel that she too would like a little breakfast, sent up 9 or 10 rashers. The lady, rallying all her powers, charged at them with her head down and swept them from the field. And so I suppose it went on, owing to the polite silence between the two social classes. I dare not think how it ended. The logical conclusion would seem to be that the servant starved and the lady burst. There's been frequent calls to refer to my size. On the occasion, for instance, of one of my many encounters with my good friend Mr. George Bernard Shaw, he prodded a finger into this ample and now notorious part of my anatomy and said, "What are you going to call it?" I said, well, if it's a girl, I shall call it Elizabeth. If it's a boy, I shall call it Gilbert Keith. But if it's just wind, I shall call it George Bernard Shaw. And on a similar occasion, I patted Shaw on his non-existent tummy and said, "I see there's been a famine." And he patted me back and said, "Yes, and we can see why, can't we?" But to return to my beginnings, the old middle class really was an educated class. It attached rather too much importance to spelling correctly. It attached enormous importance to speaking correctly, and it did spell and speak correctly. There was a whole world in which nobody was more likely to drop an H than to pick up a title. And this care about education and diction, though I can see much to criticize in it now, did have its good side. It meant my father knew all his English literature backwards, and that I knew a great deal of it by heart long before I could get it into my head. I knew pages of Shakespeare's blank verse without a notion of the meaning of most of it, which is perhaps the right way to begin to appreciate verse. And it's also recorded of me that at the age of 6 or 7 I walked down the street excitedly reciting the words, "Good Hamlet, cast this nighted colour off, and let thine eye look like a friend on Denmark. Do not forever with thy veiled lids seek for thy noble father in the dust." At which appropriate moment I tripped and pitched forward on my nose. I used to say that the account of my own life ought to consist of a series of short stories like those of Sherlock Holmes. Only his were astonishing examples of observation and mine astonishing examples of lack of observation. The tale is told that I once sent a telegram to my wife in London which read, "Am in Market Harborough. Where ought I to be?" I cannot remember whether this story is true, but it's not unlikely, or I think unreasonable. Perhaps it would be the exaggeration of eulogy to call me a tidy person. But I can always pretty satisfactorily account for all my possessions. I can always tell where they are and what I've done with them, so long as I can keep them out of my pockets. If once anything slips into these unknown abysses, I wave it a sad Virgilian farewell. The same presumption applies to the things I dropped into the sea. They tell us that on the last day the sea will give up its dead, and I suppose that on that same occasion long strings of extraordinary things will come running out of my pockets. but I've forgotten what any of them are. A railway ticket. 3rd class, Oxford to London. I'm going to tell you a story. I will not say that this story is true, because as you will soon see, it is all truth and no story. It has no explanation and no conclusion. It is, like most of the other things we encounter in life, a fragment of something else which would be intensely exciting if it were not too large to be seen. My experience was a fragment of this nature, and it is at any rate not fictitious. Not only am I not making up the incidents, what there were of them, but I'm not making up the atmosphere or the landscape, which were the whole horror of the thing. I remember them vividly, and they were truly as I shall now describe. About noon of an ashen autumn day some years ago, I was standing outside the station at Oxford, intending to take the train to London. And for some reason, out of idleness, or the emptiness of my mind, or the emptiness of the pale grey sky, or the cold, a kind of caprice fell upon me that I would not go by that train at all, but would step out on the road and walk at least part of the way to London. Now, I do not know if other people are made like me in this matter, but for me, it's always dreary weather that stings into life a sense of action and romance. On bright blue days, I do not want anything to happen. The world is complete and beautiful, a thing for contemplation. But when the background of a man's life is a grey background, then I desire to paint on it in fire and gore. So the monotonous weather seemed to render unbearable the use of the monotonous train, and I set out into the country lanes out of the town of Oxford. When I had walked for some hours, the evening was closing in. A sickly sunset clung to the horizon, as if pale with reluctance to leave the world in the dark. And as it faded more and more, the skies seemed to come closer and to threaten. The clouds, which had been merely sullen, became swollen. And then they loosened and let down the dark curtains of the rain. The rain was blinding and seemed to beat like blows from an enemy at close quarters. The skies seemed to be bending over and bawling in my ears. I walked on many more miles before I met a man. In that distance, my mind had been made up, and when I met him, I asked him if anywhere in the neighborhood I could pick up the train for London. He directed me to a small, silent station which stood well away from the road and looked as lonely as a hut on the Andes. I do not think I have ever seen such a thing as that station. It looked as if it had been raining there since the creation of the world. The water streamed from the soaking wood of it as if it were not water at all, but some loathsome liquid corruption of the wood itself, as if the solid station were eternally falling to pieces and pouring away in filth. It took me nearly 10 minutes to find a man in the station. When I did, he was a dull one. And when I asked him if there was a train to London, his answer was sleepy and vague. But as far as I could understand him, he said there would be a train in about half an hour. I sat down and lit a cigar and waited, watching the last tail of the tattered sunset and listening to the everlasting rain. It may have been in half an hour or less that a train came rather slowly into the station. It was an unnaturally dark train. I could not see a light anywhere in the long black body of it, and I could not see any guard, so I was reduced to walking up to the engine and calling out to the stoker to ask if the train was going to London. "Well, yes, sir," he said with an unaccountable kind of reluctance. "It's going to London, but—" And even as he spoke, it was just starting, and I jumped into the first carriage. It was pitch dark. I sat there, smoking and wondering, as we steamed through the continually darkening landscape lined with desolate poplars, until he slowed down and stopped irrationally in the middle of a field. I heard a heavy noise, as if someone clambering off the train, and a dark, ragged head suddenly put itself in the window. "Excuse me, sir," said the stoker, "but I think perhaps you ought to know. There's a dead man in this train. I regret to say I expressed myself politely but firmly to the effect that I didn't care so much as long as the train took me to London. But when it had started again with its unknown burden, I did do one thing, and that quite instinctively, without stopping to think. I threw away my cigar, something that is as old as man and has to do with all mourning and ceremonial, told me to do it. There was something unnecessarily horrible, it seemed to me, in the idea of there being only two men in that train, one of them dead and the other smoking a cigar. And as the red and gold of the butt end of it faded like a funeral torch trampled out at some symbolic moment of a procession, I realized the origin and essence of all ritual. That in the presence of these sacred riddles, about which we can say nothing, it is often more decent merely to do something. And I realize that ritual will always mean throwing away something, destroying our corn or wine upon the altar of the gods. When the train panted at last into Paddington Station, I sprang out of it with a newly released curiosity. There was a barrier of officials guarding the rear part of the train. No one was allowed to press towards it. They were guarding and hiding something. Perhaps death in some too shocking form, so mixed up with human mystery and wickedness that the law had to give it a sort of sanctity. I went out gladly enough into the streets and saw the lamps shining on the laughing faces. Nor have I ever known, from that day to this, what strange story I had wandered into, or what frightful thing was my companion in the dark. One day, as I was leaving London for a holiday, a friend walked into my flat in Battersea and found me surrounded with half-packed luggage. "You seem to be off on your travels," he said. "Where are you going?" "To Battersea," I replied. "The wit of your remark escapes me," he said. "I am going to Battersea," I repeated, "via Paris, Heidelberg, and Frankfurt." My remark contained no wit, it contained simple truth. I am going to wander over the whole world until once more I find Battersea. Somewhere in the seas of sunset or of sunrise, somewhere in the ancient archipelago of the earth, there is one little island which I wish to find, an island of low green hills and great white cliffs. Travellers tell me that it is called England. Scottish travellers tell me that it is called Britain. And there is a rumour that somewhere in the heart of it there is a beautiful place called Battersea. "I suppose it's unnecessary to tell you that this is Battersea," said my friend with an air of intellectual compassion. "It's quite unnecessary," I said, "and it is spiritually untrue. I cannot see any Battersea here. I cannot see any London or any England. I cannot see that door. I cannot see that chair, because a cloud of sleep and custom has come across my eyes. The only way to go back to them is to go somewhere else. The whole object of travel is not to set foot in foreign lands. It is at last to set foot on one's own country as a foreign land. The only way to go to England is to go away from it." And when after only a month's travelling I did come back to England, I was startled to find that I had told the exact truth. England did break upon me, at once beautifully new and beautifully old. A poem by me. Before the Roman came to Rye or out to Severn strode, the rolling English drunkard made the rolling English road. A rolling road that rambles round the shire, and after him the parson ran, the sexton and the squire. A merry road, a mazy road, and such as we did tread, the night we went to Birmingham by way of Beachy Head. I knew no harm of Bonaparte and plenty of the squire, and for to fight the Frenchmen I did not much desire. But I did bash their bagonets, because they came arrayed to straighten out the crooked road an English drunkard made, where you and I went down the lane with ale mugs in our hands, the night we went to Glastonbury by way of Goodwin Sands. His sins, they were forgiven him, or why do flowers run behind him, and the hedges all strengthening in the sun. The wild thing went from left to right, and knew not which was which, but the wild rose was above him when they found him in the ditch. God pardon us, nor harden us, we did not see so clear the night we went to Bannockburn by way of Brighton Pier. My friends, we will not go again, nor ape at ancient rage, or stretch the folly of our youth to be the shame of age, but walk with clearer eyes and ears this path that wandereth, and see undrugged in evening light the decent inn of death. For there is good news yet to hear, and fine things to be seen, before we go to paradise by way of Kensal Green. In the early days, it was my fate to wander over many parts of England, delivering what were politely called lectures. There was a considerable appetite for such bleak entertainment, especially in the north of England, and among certain active nonconformist centres, even in the suburbs of London. Oh, with the mention of bleakness, there comes back to me the memory of one particular chapel, lying in the last featureless wastes to the north of London, to which I actually had to make my way through a blinding snowstorm, which I enjoyed very much because I like snowstorms. I was exposed to the elements for nearly 2 hours, and by the time I arrived at the chapel, I must have roughly resembled the snowman the children make in the garden. I proceeded to lecture, God knows on what, and was about to resume my wintry journey when the worthy minister of the chapel, robustly rubbing his hands and slapping his chest, immediately opposite the chapel, under the very eyes of the nonconformist conscience. Oh, once I was nearly arrested by 2 excited policemen in Yorkshire. I was on holiday. I was engaged in that rich and intricate mass of pleasures which we disguise by the exoteric name of nothing. At the moment in question, I was throwing a big Swedish knife at a tree, practicing that useful trick by which in Stevenson's romances men murder each other. Suddenly, the forest was full of 2 policemen. They asked what the knife was, who I was, why I was throwing it, what my address was, trade, religion, opinion on the Japanese war, name a favorite cat, and so on. They also said I was damaging the tree, which was, I'm sorry to say, not true because I could not hit it. After some half hour's animated conversation, the exhibition of an envelope, an unfinished poem, which was read with great care, and I trust some profit, the elder of the 2 knights became convinced that I really was what I professed to be, that I was a journalist, that I was on the Daily News, that I lived in a particular place, that I was at present stopping with particular people in Yorkshire who happened to be wealthy and well known in the neighbourhood. The policeman acquitted me and let me pass. But, I said, what of the mangled tree? It was to the rescue of that tree, once a giant of the forest, now splintered and laid low by the brute superiority of a Swedish knife, that you rushed like knights errant. The facts of which I have just convinced you, that my name is Chesterton and that I am living with the well-known and philanthropic Mr. Blank of Ilkley, cannot have anything to do with the question of whether I have been guilty of cruelty to vegetables. I made the larger part of this speech to the empty wood, for the 2 policemen had vanished almost as quickly as they had come. It's very possible, of course, that they were elves. In that case, the somewhat illogical character of their view of crime, law, and personal responsibility would find a bright and elvish explanation. Perhaps if I had lingered in the glade till moonrise, I might have seen rings of tiny policemen dancing on the sward, or running about with glowworm lamps, arresting grasshoppers for damaging blades of grass. But taking the bolder hypothesis that they really were policemen, I found myself in a certain difficulty. I was certainly accused of something which was either an offence or was not. I was let off because it was proved I was a guest at a well-known house. The inference seems painfully clear. Either it is not a proof of infamy to throw a knife about in a lonely wood, or else it is a proof of innocence to know a rich man. Some time ago, while I was meditating upon morality, I was, so to speak, snatched up and put in a jury box to try people. I was put into this jury box because I lived in Battersea and my name began with the C. Looking round me, I saw that there were also summoned in attendance in the courts whole crowds and processions of men, all of whom lived in Battersea and all of whose names began with a C. It seems that they always summon jurymen in this sweeping alphabetical way. At one official blow, Battersea is denuded of all its C's and left to get on as best it can with the rest of the alphabet. We settle down with a rollicking ease in our seats, for we are a devil-may-care race, the C's of Battersea. And an oath was administered to us in an almost inaudible manner. We understood, however, that we were to well and truly try the case between our sovereign lord the king and the prisoner at the bar, neither of whom had as yet put in an appearance. Just as I was wondering whether the king and the prisoner were perhaps coming to an amicable understanding in some adjoining public house, the prisoner's head appeared above the barrier of the dock. He was accused of stealing bicycles and was the great image of a good friend of mine. We did well and truly try the case between the king and the prisoner, and we came to the conclusion that the king was in no way implicated. Then we passed on to a woman who had neglected her children and who looked as if somebody or something had neglected her. Never have I stood to pain. And out of this came a curious realization of a political or social truth. I saw with an indescribable kind of clearness what a jury really is and why we must never let it go. The trend of our epoch has been consistently towards specialism and professionalism. We tend to have trained soldiers because they fight better, trained singers because they sing better, trained dancers because they dance better, and so on and so on. And the principle has been applied to law and politics. Now, one of the 4 or 5 paradoxes which should be taught to every infant prattling at his mother's knee is the following: that the more a man looks at a thing, the less he can see it. And the more a man learns a thing, the less he knows it. It is a terrible business to mark out a man for vengeance, but it is a thing to which a man can grow accustomed, as he can to other terrible things. The horrible thing about all legal officials, even the best, about all judges, magistrates, barristers, detectives, and policemen, is not that they're wicked. Some of them are quite good. Not that they're stupid. Several of them are quite intelligent. It's simply that they've got used to it. Strictly, they do not see the prisoner in the dock. All they see is the usual man in the usual place. They do not see their awful court of judgment. They see only their own workshop. Therefore, the instinct of Christian civilization has most wisely declared that into their judgments there shall upon every occasion be infused fresh blood and fresh thoughts from the streets. Men shall come in who can see the court and see the crowd, and the coarse faces of policemen and professional criminals, the wasted faces of the wastrels, the unreal faces of the gesticulating counsel, and see it all as one sees a new picture or a play hitherto unvisited. Our civilization has decided that determining the guilt and innocence of men is a thing too important to be trusted to trained men. It wishes for light upon that awful matter, so it asks men who know no more law than I know, but who can feel the things that I felt in that jury box. When it wants a library catalogued or a solar system discovered or any trifle of that kind, it uses up its specialists. But when it wishes anything done which is really serious, it collects 12 ordinary men. The same thing was done, if I remember correctly, by the founder of Christianity. another poem. The Donkey. When fishes flew, and forests walked, and figs grew upon thorn, some moment when the moon was blood, then surely I was born. With monstrous head and sickening cry, and ears like errant wings, the devil's walking parody on all four-footed things. The tattered outlaw of the earth, of ancient crooked will, starve, scourge, deride me, I am dumb, I keep my secret still. Fools, for I also had my hour, one far fierce hour and sweet. There was a shout about my ears, and palms before my feet. When people ask me, or indeed anybody else, why did you join the Church of Rome? The first essential answer, if it is partly an elliptical answer, is to get rid of my sins. For there is no other religious system that does really profess to get rid of people's sins. It's confirmed by the logic, which to many seems startling, by which the Church deduces that sin confessed and adequately repented is actually abolished, and that the sinner does really begin again, as if he had never sinned. And this brought me sharply back to those visions of childhood, the indescribable and indestructible certitude in the soul that those first years of innocence were the beginning of something worthy, perhaps more worthy than any of the things that actually followed them. I spoke of the strange daylight, which was something more than the light of common day, that still seems in my memory to shine on those steep roads down from Camden Hill, from which one could see the Crystal Palace from afar. Well, when a Catholic comes from confession, he does truly, by definition, step out again into that dawn of his own beginning and look with new eyes across the world to a crystal palace that really is of crystal. He believes in the dim corner and in that brief ritual, God has really remade him in his own image. He's now a new experiment of the Creator. He's as much a new experiment as he was when he was 5 years old. He stands, as I said, in the white light at the worthy beginning of the life of a man. The accumulations of time can no longer terrify. He may be grey and gouty, but he is only 5 minutes old. I've sometimes been haunted with a vague story about a wild and fantastic uncle, the enemy of parents and the cause of revolution in the nurseries, who went about preaching a certain theory. I mean, the theory that all the objects which children use at Christmas for what we call riotous or illegitimate purposes were originally created for those purposes, and not for the humdrum household purposes which they now serve. For instance, we will suppose that the story begins with a pillow fight in a night nursery, and boys buffeting and bashing each other with those white and shapeless clubs. The uncle, who would be a professor of immense learning and even greater imagination and inventiveness, would proceed to make himself unpopular with parents and popular with children by proving that the pillow in prehistoric art is obviously designed to be a club, that the sham fight in the night nursery is actually more ancient and authoritative than the whole institution of beds and bedclothes, that in some innocent morning of the world, such cherubim warred on each other with such clouds, possibly made of white samite, mystic, wonderful, and stuffed with feathers from the angels' wings, and that it was only afterwards, when weariness fell upon the world and the young gods had grown tired of their godlike sports, that they slept with their heads upon these weapons. And so, by a gradual dislocation of the whole original purpose of a pillow, it came to be recognized as having its proper place on a bed. Any number of these legends could be launched with ease and grace and general gratification. it would be urged to eagerly assenting little boys that catapults are really older and more majestic than windows. Windows were merely targets set up for catapults, clear and fragile, that such archaic archers might be rewarded with a crash and sparkle of crystal. That it was only after the oppressor of the Middle Paleolithic had ruthlessly suppressed the catapult culture that people had gradually come to use the now useless glass targets for purposes of light and ventilation. Similarly, butter was originally used solely for the purpose of making butter slides in the paths of parents and guardians. And it was only by a late accident in the life of some prominent though prostrate citizen who happened to lick the pavement that its edible qualities were discovered. True, I cannot set forth here in any great detail any actual proofs of these prehistoric origins, but it seems to me we have as much right to imagine cheerful origins as, for instance, Dr. Freud has to imagine gloomy ones. And we beg to announce with the same authority that everything began with a celestial pillow fight of cherubs, and that the whole world was made entirely for the games of children. Mentioning an uncle is enough to recall even wider memories. One of my first is playing in the garden under the care of a girl with ropes of golden hair, to whom my mother called out from the house, "You are an angel," which I was disposed to accept without metaphor. She's now living in Vancouver as Mrs. Kidd. I was once interviewed on one of those programs on the wireless in which the person being interrogated was asked a series of standard questions, among which was the following. If you were marooned on a desert island, which book would you most like to have with you? Naturally, many who were asked this question answered it variously. Some said Shakespeare, Milton, Dickens, and so on. Not a few said the Bible. I must confess I took a different view of this matter, and I said that should I find myself under such circumstances, the book I would most like to have with me would be Thomson's Guide to Practical Boat Building. There was another time when I was asked what I thought of Mr. George Bernard Shaw. I had no difficulty in answering that I thought of Mr. George Bernard Shaw very much as I had always thought of him. I actually wrote a book about him in the ancient days, and I'm happy to say that he reviewed it himself, with the typical opening, "This is the best work of literary art that I have yet provoked." I was destined to see some of Shaw's skylarking on one occasion, and to be privileged to play the fool with him far from the political platform, if not so very far from the theatrical stage. It began by Bernard Shaw coming to my house in Beaconsfield in the heartiest spirits and proposing that we should appear together disguised as cowboys in a film of some sort projected by Sir James Barrie. I will not describe the purpose or character of the performance because nobody ever discovered it, with the exception presumably of Sir James. But throughout the proceedings, even Barrie had the appearance of concealing his secret from himself. All I could gather was that two other well-known persons, Lord Howard de Walden and Mr. William Archer, the grave Scottish critic and translator of Ibsen, had also consented to be cowboys. "Well," I said, after a somewhat blank pause of reflection, "God forbid that anyone should say that I could not see a joke if Mr. William Archer could see it." Then, after a pause, I asked, "But what is the joke?" Shaw replied with hilarious vagueness that nobody knew what the joke was. That was the joke. The mysterious proceeding divided itself into two parts. One consisted of an appointment in a sort of abandoned brickfield somewhere in the wilds of Essex, in which spot, it was alleged, our cow-punching costumes were already concealed. The other consisted of an invitation to supper at the Savoy to talk things over with Barrie and Granville Barker. I kept both these melodramatic assignations, and though neither of them threw any light upon what we were supposed to be doing, they were both very amusing in their way, and rather different from what one might have expected. We went down to the wasteland in Essex, and found our Wild West equipment. But considerable indignation was felt against William Archer, who, with true Scottish foresight, arrived there first and put on the best pair of trousers. They were indeed a magnificent pair of fur trousers, while the other 3 riders of the prairie had to be content with canvas trousers. A running commentary upon this piece of individualism continued throughout the afternoon, while we were being rolled in barrels, roped over fake precipices, and eventually turned loose in a field to lasso wild ponies, which were so tame that they ran after us instead of our running after them, and nosed in our pockets for pieces of sugar. Whatever may be the strain on credulity, it's also a fact that we all got onto the same motor bicycle, the wheels of which were spun round under us to produce the illusion of hurtling like a thunderbolt down the mountain pass. When the rest finally vanished over the cliffs, clinging to the rope, they left me behind as a necessary weight to secure it. And Granville Barker kept calling out to me to register self-sacrifice and register resignation, which I did with such wild and sweeping gestures as occurred to me, not, I am proud to say, without general applause. Now, about this time, Barry, with his little figure behind his large pipe, was standing about in an impenetrable manner, and nothing could extract from him the faintest indication of why we were being put through these ordeals. It was as if the smoke that rose from that pipe was a vapor not only of magic, but of black magic. But the other half of the mystery was, if possible, more mysterious. It was all the more mysterious because it was public, not to say crowded. I went to the Savoy supper under the impression that Barry and Barker would explain to a small party some small part of the scheme. Instead of that, I found the stage of the Savoy Theatre thronged with nearly everybody in London, as the society papers say when they mean everybody in society. From the Prime Minister, Mr. Asquith, to the most cryptic Oriental attaché, they were all there dining at little tables and talking about everything but the matter at hand. At least, they were all there except Sir James Barry, who on this occasion made himself almost completely invisible. Towards the end of the meal, Sir Edward Elgar casually remarked to my wife, "I suppose you know you're being filmed all this time." From what I know of my wife, it's unlikely that she was brandishing a champagne bottle or otherwise attracting social attention. But some of them were throwing bread about and showing marked relaxation from the cares of state. Then the original 4, whom destiny had selected for a wild western life, were approached with private instructions, which worked out in public as follows. The stage was cleared, and the company adjourned to the auditorium, where Bernard Shaw harangued them in a furious speech with savage gesticulations, denouncing Barker and Barry, and finally drawing a sword. The other 3 of us rose at this signal, also brandishing swords, and stormed the stage, going out through the back scenery. And there we, whoever we were, disappear forever from the record and reasonable understanding of mankind. For never from that day to this has the faintest light been thrown on the reasons for our remarkable behavior. I have since heard in a remote and roundabout way a certain vague suggestion to the effect that there was some symbolical notion of our vanishing from real life and being captured or caught up in the film world of romance, being engaged through all the rest of the play in struggling to fight our way back to reality. Whether this was the idea, I have never known for certain. I only know that I received immediately afterwards a friendly and apologetic note from Sir James Barry saying that the whole scheme was going to be dropped. I do not know, but I have often wondered, and have sometimes fancied that there was another sense, darker than my own fancy, in which the secret put in Barry's pipe had ended in smoke. There had really been a sort of unearthly unreality in all the levity of those last hours, like something high and shrill that might crack. And it did crack. I've sometimes wondered whether it was felt that this fantasy of fashionable London would appear incongruous with something that happened some days later. For what happened then was that a certain ultimatum went out from the Austrian government against Serbia. I rang up Maurice Baring at a further stage of that rapidly developing business, and I can remember the tones of his voice when he said, "We've got to fight. They've all got to fight. I don't see how anybody can help it." If the cowboys were indeed struggling to find the road back to reality, they found it all right. The aim of life is appreciation. There's no sense in not appreciating things. And there's no sense in having more of them if you have less appreciation of them. I once said that a Cockney lamppost painted pea green was better than no light or no life, and that if it was a lonely lamppost, we might really see its light better against the background of the dark. The modern millionaire comes bustling along the street to tell me he is an optimist and has 2,005,000 new lampposts, already painted not a Victorian pea green, but a futuristic chrome yellow and electric blue, and that he will plant them over the whole world in such numbers that nobody will notice them, especially as they will all look exactly the same. And I cannot quite see what the optimist has got to be optimistic about. A lamppost can be significant although it is ugly. But he's not making lampposts significant, he's making them insignificant. In short, as it seems to me, it matters very little whether a man is discontented if his discontent paralyzes his power of appreciating what he has got. The real difficulty of man is not to enjoy lampposts or landscapes, not to enjoy dandelions or chops, but to enjoy enjoyment, to keep the capacity of really liking what he likes. That is the practical problem which the philosopher has to solve. And it seemed to me at the beginning, as it seems to me now in the end, that the pessimists and optimists of the modern world have alike missed and muddled the matter through leaving out the ancient conception of humility and the thanks of the unworthy. And as I begin to believe more and more that a clue was to be found in such principles, even if it was a paradox, I was more and more disposed to seek out those who specialized in humility, though for them it was the door of heaven, and for me the door of earth. For me, my end is my beginning, and this overwhelming conviction that there is one key which can unlock all doors brings me back to my first glimpse of the glorious gift of the senses and the sensational experience of sensation. And there starts up again before me, standing sharp and clear as in old, the figure of a man who crosses a bridge and who carries a key, as I saw him when I first looked into fairyland through the window of my father's toy theatre. Thank you, and good day.
You've been listening to GKC by Tony Van Bridge, the last in this year's Bell Canada Reading Series from the Shaw Festival. It was based on the writings of G.K. Chesterton and adapted and directed by Christopher Newton and Tony Van Bridge. In the part of Gilbert Keith Chesterton, you heard Neil Barclay. The Bell Canada Reading Series is recorded live at the Royal George Theatre in Niagara-on-the-Lake, Ontario, with special thanks going to Bill Talbot, Jim Smagata, and Christine Oakey. The recording engineer was Joe Mahoney, and the producer of the Bell Canada Reading Series is Barbara Worthy. That's it for tonight.